This is the first lecture for week 8 in HOS 121, and we're going to look at psychosocial development in middle childhood this week, starting with looking at the family and considering families as systems and looking at the sibling relationship. So first we'll begin by talking about family systems theory and how that can help us understand dynamics in families. And then we'll look specifically at the relationship between siblings and what factors can influence that relationship, and also how those relationships can impact children's development. So your reading talks about the idea of a systems view of families, and this connects to what we talked about in week 3 with the Bronfenbrenner ecological model. That's also a systems view, and so the idea is that families are part of various systems. You can see in this graphic that comes from the reader that you can see the families in the center, and they're surrounded by some of the different microsystems that they experience, like neighborhood, extended family, school, religious organizations, and work, and then the macro system influences like culture. So a systems view of families thinks about how families are influenced by different systems, and also how the family itself is a system, which I'll talk more about, how families interact and how different members are affected by each other. And family systems theory is a really important theory for those of you who are considering becoming psychologists or social workers, because it's a major theory in the counseling field. It's often used for family therapy as a kind of foundation of family therapy. So this idea, what does it mean to say that a family is a system? And the idea is really that as members of a family, every member is interconnected with each other, and that there are subsystems within the system. So the family is the broader system, but then there are subsystems that would be the parent-parent relationship, so the partnership that's between parents, or the sibling-to-sibling relationship, that's the sibling subsystem, or the parent-child relationship, which we've already talked about with parenting. And so, the idea that image I can give you here is to think about a mobile that you would hang over a baby's bed, or like a wind chime. If you move one part of it, all the other parts move. And families are like that too. So when one member of a family system changes, it influences the other members of the family system as well. So we'll talk about that in the context of conflict between the parents, for example. But you can think about this, there's a bidirectional influence that's happening here. So children are influencing their parents, parents are influencing their children. The parent-parent relationship is influencing the sibling-sibling relationship. Family systems theory sort of is a way of thinking about all these simultaneous influences that are going on in the family. And again, because this is commonly used in therapy, therapists will use this to think about how a problem that happens in a family isn't just located in an individual and an individual's behavior, but it's really in the system of interaction. So if there's a problem in the sibling-sibling relationship, it may be due to an issue in the parent-child relationship. So for example, if a parent favors one of the siblings, that can cause conflict among the two siblings. Or if there's conflict between siblings, maybe they're picking up on conflict between the two parents, and there's tension in the relationship. So again, family systems theory is a way to help us think about how the different parts, about how a family functions and how individuals within a family are influenced when there's change in the other members in the family. So as I said, the family systems theory has this idea of subsystems. There's the family overall, but then there are the subsystems of the relationships that exist among members. So there's a relationship that exists between parents, for example, and the parent-parent relationship, which may be, the partnership, like a marriage between the parents, can influence the children in that family, of course. And so if there's conflict between the two parents, that can have harmful impacts on children. So it can make children feel more fearful and more anxious, and it can make them feel sad, threatened. So it can have an impact, an emotional impact on children. And then conflict between the parents can also impact the parent-child relationships. So if two parents are having conflict, that can impact on the ability of one of those parents, or both of those parents, to parent the child in a sensitive, responsive way. So that, again, that's an example of how family systems theory suggests that families function. If there's conflict between the two parents, that's going to impact the parent-child relationship, and it can result in emotional distress for the child and more compromised parenting from the parent. And other things that are going on with parents, of course, can also influence children. So unemployment and work stress can also undermine parenting skills. Parents can bring that in, from the other systems that they participate in, and that stress can come out in terms of their relationships with their children. And then if there's conflict with the parent-parent system and the couple relationship, that can reorganize the family system. So again, if you think of things like a mobile, and one part moves and the other part moves, when there's a separation or a divorce, it reorganizes what the family system looks like. So now, parents are separated, and children may be having a custody arrangement where they're spending some of their time with one parent and some with another. And so that can also really change their dynamics in terms of how the parent relates to the child and how the child relates to the parent, and even the sibling relationship, because it's changed the way that whole family functions as a system. And family systems theory also suggests that having a new sibling come into the family also has a big impact on the family. So again, that's a change within the system that affects everybody within the system. And for firstborn children, they'll spend some portion of their lives as an only child, although it may be as short as less than a year. But then when a new sibling is born, that creates a disequilibrium again, for the family as they're adjusting to this change, and also for the older child. It's a major change in the life of that firstborn child. And you can see behaviors in firstborn children when they're adjusting to having a new sibling. Sometimes they have regressions in their behavior. So if they've, just recently started to have some kind of developmental task, like, sleeping through the night, for example, or having some other way they're getting a bit more independent, sometimes they regress to an earlier stage. And also sometimes you can see that children become more withdrawn as they are adjusting to this experience and to the change in their relationship with their parent, who now has another child also to look after. But it makes a big difference if parents are responsive to children and involved and are sensitive, to acknowledge that it is a big change for the firstborn child when a new child comes along. So again, this is a place where that kind of warm, responsive parenting that you see in authoritative parents makes a big difference for children's outcomes. There's a number of factors that influence the quality of the relationship between siblings. So one general rule of thumb is around the sex and age of children. Children tend to be closer to same-sex siblings and siblings who are closer to them in age. And really having those similarities in age and being of the same sex gives children access to more similar experiences and common interests that can encourage them to play together and spend time together and create that sense of closeness. As we talked about last week, children tend to have gender differences in play, and children seek out same-sex children to play with. And so having that commonality with a sibling creates a closer bond in general. Another factor that influences sibling relationships is the temperament of the children. So children who are high intensity, high activity, low persistence tend to have more conflict with their siblings, and they also may have more issues around emotional regulation and conflict resolution, and that can, again, relate to how the two children relate and the amount of conflict that they have. The emotional climate of the family can influence sibling relationships, particularly if there's a lot of stress in the family that relates to hostile parenting. So this, how the family deals with issues if there is conflict between the two parents, does that impact the children in terms of and having more negative parenting? And if that's the case, then there can be an impact on the sibling relationship. And then in general, the parent-child relationship, if there's positive relationships between parents and children, that's associated with more positive sibling relationships. Particularly when children feel secure in their attachment relationship with their parent, they're more likely to have positive sibling relationships. And also, when there isn't a sense of favoritism, so children really object to that sense of favoritism, and if that is there, that can lead to more negative relationships among siblings. Another factor about siblings that can influence children's development is the birth order. So the experience of being a firstborn versus a later born child, where firstborns have more of that time only being exposed, to the time with adults in the family, whereas with the later born children, they're getting a lot of socialization influence from the older siblings. And there's also some, interesting research that's looked at IQ and birth order. So it's not discussed in your readings, but IQ being, a measure of intelligence, there's some evidence that children who are firstborn tend to have a higher IQ, and there's been various kinds of explanations that people have come up with for that. And one is that children who are firstborn have a lot of opportunities to teach younger children, and so they really reinforce what they know by teaching the younger child. And also that firstborn children tend to get more resources, particularly parental time, than younger born children. So that is actually a fairly robust finding from the research literature, is that there is an impact of birth order on IQ. And part of it is, how much time children have been exposed to just adults and adult speech, for example, and also the opportunity for older siblings to be the teachers of their younger siblings. And siblings do a lot to socialize each other, and so siblings can be agents of socialization for each other. So, for example, children learn various norms through their sibling relationship. So most parents, are really encourage children to settle conflicts and to respect each other's property, to share resources, to comfort each other. So parents try to encourage their children in those kinds of attitudes with their sibling relationship. So they'll do a lot of reinforcement and direct instruction around how they should act with their siblings. And so that's a way that children learn those kinds of norms around how to share with others and how to resolve conflict. Another thing that children learn is attribution of behaviors. So children can learn why people do something when they have conflict with their peers, when the parents help them understand, for example, the negative behavior from a sibling. So, oh, she didn't mean to say that, she had a bad day. And it's a way that children can start to be socialized and understand motives behind behaviors. And so the sibling relationship can be valuable for that. Another thing that we've talked about is pro-social attitudes. So how children learn how to have positive behaviors that benefit others. Often parents encourage their children to act like that with their siblings. So, they encourage their children to have positive behaviors where they share and they negotiate and they help, rather than antisocial attitudes where they harm or hit, for example. Self-esteem is another outcome that's really can be associated with siblings. And I already mentioned this around preferential treatment. So, parents can convey messages to children in terms of how they treat the siblings. And so children tend to have better self-esteem when they feel that they're being treated equally and have that they're receiving the equal amount of love as their sibling. So that's an important impact on self-esteem. And then gender roles are also something that children learn often from their siblings. So siblings are a way that, girls learn about boys and boys learn about girls, or girls watch their older sisters and learn how girls should be. So children are often imitating siblings or observing siblings to learn about how to act within their gender role. And then something I wanted to add, because we've been talking about identity as one of our themes, is that there's a concept called sibling de-identification, where siblings will, unconsciously or consciously try to develop an identity that's unique from their sibling. So you might think about this for your family. If you had a really athletic sibling, maybe you tried to be more the sibling who was good in school, or if your sibling had a particular hobby, maybe you chose an alternative hobby to that one. So it's particularly considered to be important sibling de-identification for siblings who are closer in age and who are competing for that parental attention. And this relates to the idea of sibling rivalry as well, which we're going to talk about in tutorial. So again, thinking about the family system, what does it take for a sibling to de-identify from the other sibling to make a unique space in the family system? So we'll talk about that, your experiences with sibling rivalry in this week's tutorial. And finally, this all begs the question, what about only children? So if siblings are so important for socialization, what happens when children don't have siblings? And actually, only children, despite the stereotypes, they actually do very well. The consensus is that only children do just fine, and that they're similarly socially adjusted to children who do have siblings. And when there are differences, research has found, it's tended to be in the favor of only children, where they tend to have positive social skills and have good personal adjustment to new situations. So it may be that only children have to adjust, and they have to come up with, make friends and develop those types of friendship skills and social competence because they don't have a built-in playmate. But despite the stereotypes, only children tend to perform well in terms of social competence. They're not necessarily, they may be spoiled, you may know of some who are, but in general, they tend to have good social skills. So we'll leave that here, and then our later lectures this week will look at schools, and we'll also look at peer relationships. And the sibling relationship resembles peer relationships in that it's an egalitarian relationship. It's a relationship between two equals. So it's different from parent-child relationships. And so that's sort of a characteristic of how people relate to their siblings and to their peers that we'll talk about later in this week.